Room 13, Chapter 18. They walked through the old town, up the 199 steps and across the graveyard to the Abbey. They were in their group, so Fliss didn't get to talk to Lisa, who, with Trot, was in Mrs. Marriott's group. She talked to Gary, who these days always smelled of peppermint. She told him how she'd seen inside the cupboard and that it was just a cupboard. She told him how sick Ellie May looked and about the blood on her neck. When she told him about the blood, his cheeks went pale and he whispered, "Crikey, are you sure, Fliss?" She assured him she was, absolutely sure. He told her he'd overheard Mrs. Evans and Mr. Hepworth talking. Mrs. Wilkinson had been there too. They were discussing Ellie May. Mrs. Evans said she thought they should phone Ellie May's parents. Mr. Hepworth was in favour of waiting another day. It was probably just a touch of flu, he said. Mrs. Wilkinson mentioned homesickness and the change of water. It happened all the time, she assured them. Children were in and out of the Crow's Nest every week between Easter and October, and nearly every group there was one child who grew pale and listless and lost its appetite through homesickness and the change of water. "I didn't hear the end of it," said Gary, "but I think they decided to wait till tomorrow." Fliss scowled. "Grown-ups are so stupid," she muttered. "They never believe anything you tell them. If Ellie May goes in that cupboard again tonight, it might be too late to call her parents." "What are we going to do? Shall I have a go at talking to old Hepworth?" "No, I told you he thinks the whole thing's a tale and that it was you who made it up." "Yeah," sighed Gary, "he would. I always get the blame for everything. It's the same at home." "When we're looking round the Abbey," said Fliss, "they won't keep us in our groups. Let's talk to Trot and Lisa, see what they think." There wasn't much left of the Abbey, just some crumbling sections of wall, very high in places, with tidy lawns in between. There were a lot of sightseers, though, including other school groups, and it was easy for Fliss and the other three to get together behind a chunk of ancient masonry and talk. Fliss told Trot and Lisa her story, and they tossed ideas back and forth. In the end it came to this. None of the teachers would believe them, so they were on their own. They were all agreed that Ellie May must not be allowed to enter the cupboard again, so they'd watch, and if she came by they'd stop her, by force if necessary. "Right," said Fliss, "that's settled. Now do you think we can forget about Ellie May and that ghastly cupboard just for a few hours and have some fun? We're supposed to be on holiday, you know." Gary pulled a wry face. "It won't be easy, Fliss." Trot shrugged. "I'm scared as a rat thinking about tonight, but what's the point? Fretting isn't going to make it go away, so we might as well enjoy ourselves while we can." "Trot's right," said Lisa. "We're on holiday. Let's at least explore some of these ruins before the teachers get bored and call us together." They split up and wandered about, gazing at the walls and the high, slender windows. Fliss tried to imagine what the place must have looked like long ago, with a roof and stained glass and flagstones where all this grass now grew, but it was impossible. "Anyway," she told herself, "I like it better as it is now. You can see the sky, there are birds and grass and sunlight, and I don't like gloomy places." She shivered. Chapter 19. They stayed an hour among the ruins, then assembled for the cliff-top walk to Saltwick Bay. It was just after 11 o'clock. The sun, which had shone brightly as they left the Crow's Nest, was now a fuzzy pink ball. A cool breeze was coming off the sea, and the eastern horizon was hidden by mist. Mr. Hepworth gazed out to sea. "This mist is known as a sea fret," he told them, "and sea frets are very common on this coast. You probably feel a bit chilled just now, but once we start walking you'll be all right." He turned and pointed. "That collection of buildings is the Coastguard station. The path goes right past it, and that's where this morning's walking really begins. Who can tell us what coastguards do? Yes, Keith." "Guard the coast, sir?" "Well, yes. What sort of things do they look out for, do you think?" "Shipwrecks, sir. People drowning and that." "That's right. Vessels or persons in trouble at sea, including those silly beggars who keep getting themselves washed out on lilos and old tyres. They also watch for people stuck or injured on cliffs and for distress rockets and signs of foul weather." "Right, let's go." They filed across the Abbey plain and up past the Coastguard station. The path was part of the Cleveland Way, and countless boots had churned it into sticky mud, permanent except in the longest dry spells. Because of this, duck boards had been laid down so that most of the path between Whitby and Saltwick was under wooden slats. "What a weird track," said Maureen. "It's like a raft that goes on forever." "I hope it doesn't go on forever," her twin retorted. "It kills your feet." It didn't go on forever. They'd been walking 25 minutes on the flat and over stiles when the boards ended and they found themselves on a tarmac road which went through the middle of a caravan holiday camp. Just beyond the camp was a muddy pathway which led from the cliff top to the beach. Mr. Hepworth lifted his hand. "Right, this is Saltwick Bay." He looked at his watch. "It's 25 to 12, and if it stays fine we'll be here till about 4:30, so there's plenty of time. We'll eat lunch at 12:30. In the meantime, you may paddle, play on the sand, look for fossils in the cliff face, or collect shells and pebbles on the beach. You are not, repeat, not, to do any of the following: sit down in the surf and get your clothing wet, attempt to climb the cliff, throw stones or other hard missiles, murder one another, chuck your best friend into the sea, utter shrieks, bellows, or similar prehistoric noises, or find a tiny child with a sandcastle and flatten the sandcastle, the tiny child, or both. Is that clear? It was. The bay was sandy in some parts and rocky in others. Fliss and Lisa sat on a rock to remove their boots and socks, then ran down to the water's edge, where they rolled up their jeans and waited for a wavelet to wash over their feet. "Oh, it's freezing!" Fliss scampered clear and stood with her hands in her anorak pockets, curling her toes in the wet sand. Lisa gasped and screwed up her face, but refused to budge. The wavelet spent itself and rushed back. "Hey, that's weird." She flung out her arms for balance. "If you look down when the wave's going back, you seem to be sliding backwards up the beach at terrific speed, like skiing in reverse. I nearly fell over." "I remember that from when I was little," said Fliss. "It happened the first time I ever paddled. I howled, and it was ages before my mum could get me in the sea again." "There's something else as well," laughed Lisa, as a second wavelet ran back. "The water washes the sand away from under your heels. It's like a big hole opening up to swallow you. I bet that's why you were frightened. Come and have a go." They played along the edge of the sea till it was 12:30, and Mrs. Evans called them to come and eat lunch. They sat on rocks and munched, burying their feet in the dry sand for warmth. "I'd no idea it was lunch time," said Fliss. "We only seem to have been here about 5 minutes." "That's 'cause we're having fun," Lisa replied. "If it was Matt, it'd seem like 5 hours." Grant Cooper and Robert Field had been looking for fossils along the foot of the cliff. They'd dug some out and brought them back in a polythene bag. Mr. Hepworth tipped them on a flat rock and spread them out. Everybody gathered round, and the teacher picked out the best specimens. "Look at this." He held up a slender cylindrical object which came to a point at one end. "This is a belemnite. It lived in the sea millions of years ago and looked something like a squid." "It looks something like a bullet now," observed Andrew Roberts. Mrs. Evans gave him one of her looks. "And this one's a graphia, or devil's toenail, to give it its popular name. It looks similar to a mussel, but it too lived millions of years ago. And this," he held up a thick disc with a curled pattern on it, "is an ammonite. It looks snail-like, and you might think it slithered slowly along the seabed, but it didn't. It swam, catching its food with its many tentacles." "How do they know, sir?" asked Haley Denton. "Know what, Haley?" "That it swam about, sir. There were no people then, and there are no Amorites or whatever now, so how do they know what it did?" "Ah, good question, Haley. Well, one thing they do is look at creatures which are built in a similar way and are alive today. There's a creature called the Nautilus, which is something like an ammonite. They know how it gets around, so they're pretty sure the ammonite got around in a similar way. Do you see?" "Yes, sir." When everything had been eaten and washed down with canned pop, the children went off in twos and threes to do whatever they felt like doing. It was 1:15. The mist had thickened, blotting out the sun, and the breeze gusted spitefully, sharp with blown sand. The holiday makers had withdrawn to their caravan, so that the children of Bottom Top Middle had the beach to themselves. They went barefoot, but did not remove their anoraks. Fliss and Lisa ranged far along the tide line, looking for shells and fancy pebbles. They found no shells except some blue-black fragments of broken mussel, which they spurned. There were plenty of pebbles there, and some were quite pretty, especially when wet. They picked up the best ones, putting them in the bags they'd saved from lunch. It was absorbing work, and when Fliss finally looked up, she was amazed to see how far they'd come. "Hey, look, we're miles from anyone else. The teachers look like dots." "That's just how I like them," chuckled Lisa. "We can't go any further, though. We've run out of beach." It was true. In front of them a great dark headland jutted into the sea. Gulls skimmed along, screaming along the face of its cliff, but the still air felt less cold. "There's no wind here," said Fliss. "Let's stay for a bit. Look, the tide swept all the rubbish into a corner like Mrs. Clark at school. There might be something good." They waded through the flotsam with their heads down, turning it over with their feet, exclaiming from time to time as some new find came to light. A lobster pot smashed in a storm, a clump of orange line hopelessly tangled, a dead gull. Fliss worked steadily along the base of the cliff, seeking mermaids and Spanish gold. She heard the hiss of surf on sand and glanced up to find she'd almost reached the sea. As she stood looking out, her eyes were drawn to a dark, spray-drenched rock, and to the bird which sat on it. It was black, and it held out its ragged wings as though waiting for the wind to dry them. Fliss shivered as she gazed at it, feeling the magic drain out of the day. It reminded her of something, a witch perhaps, or a broken umbrella, or the iron crow on the gate of fate.